Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Primal Shift podcast. In today's episode, we're gonna talk about why pasture-raised chicken and pork are terrible for your health. I know this sounds shocking, but I have a very special guest with me today, Dr. Anthony Gustin, who has been testing a lot of the chickens that you can buy commercially and some that he's raised himself to find out what it is with chicken and pork in general that makes it a much poorer choice of meat than the meat of ruminant animals. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about some of the misconceptions around poultry and pork and why pasture-raised is not necessarily much better than conventionally raised. We're going to talk about the different fatty acid composition in monogastric and ruminant animals. We're going to talk about some of the misleading marketing language that you might see out there, like omega-3 chicken. We're going to talk about how the chickens that we eat have changed in form and size over the years and why today we are pretty much eating obese babies as far as the chickens are concerned. And we're going to talk about what are some of the best ways that you can use to include or to incorporate chicken and pork in your diet. If you don't know Dr. Anthony Gustin, he's a great human being. He's a functional medicine clinician, food and fitness skeptic, founder, investor, farmer, and not a guru, he says. He writes one of the best newsletters out there, the one that I actually read every single time, and has a great podcast, the Natural State podcast. He's the founder of Equip, one of my favorite supplement brands out there. Especially the kids love the beef protein that they mix with raw milk to make chocolate milk. He is the original founder, one of the original founders of Perfect Keto, and overall a visionary and great human being. I'm going to link everything you need to know about Anthony down in the show notes, so check that out, including a discount code for Equip. And with that, we're going to get started. All right, Anthony, thanks so much for making the time today. I really appreciate it. I know you're busy, but I know that you have a lot of experience with chickens and pigs and raising your own animals and just figuring out, how healthy those animals really are, maybe in comparison to some of the other types of meat that we usually eat. And so maybe let's just start out talking about what are the differences between ruminant animals like cows and goats and sheep and monogastric animals from a fatty acid perspective, as well as from a health perspective. How do those different types of fats in the meat potentially impact our health?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, appreciate it. The difference between ruminant animals and monogastric animals is basically just the digestive system. So a monogastric animal is much like us, just one stomach. So when you eat something, just goes into a stomach chamber, then goes into your intestines, and that's how food gets assimilated into the body. With ruminant animals, they actually do a fermentation process. And like with cattle, for example, they have 4 different chambers of basically 4 different stomachs, each having a very different function for breaking down and turning cellulose and plant matter basically into saturated fat, into short 2-carbon chains saturated fat and butyrate, things like that. And then that gets assimilated into the bloodstream. So a very different digestion process. One's effectively fermentation based, and one is much like ours, which is basically breaking down things into small parts and then absorbing whatever you're eating in much smaller components rather than fermenting it and changing it before it goes into your bloodstream.
Right. And what does it mean in terms of, you mentioned, the fermentation causes the creation of or formation of saturated fats. So does it mean then meat from a cow has more saturated fat than polyunsaturated in comparison to a monogastric animal?
Yeah, typically less. I think that the interesting thing is to think about what is species appropriate and what is the natural environment provide for each of these species. And so when you look at fatty acid composition, for example, and you look at some of the things that make seed oils really interesting as a topic, is this certain fatty acid called linoleic acid, which is 18 carbon double unsaturated fat, which we can get into the science of linoleic acid and why that's probably not great to have in high amounts. It's naturally occurring in most foods that have fat, but with humans, with cows, with chickens and pigs, there's studies that show all of these things should be around 2 to 3% of total fat. Mm-hmm. And what happens with the fermentation for cattle is that they can maintain that similar perspective of what they should be eating no matter what you feed them. So even if you feed cattle tons of grain and tons of stuff, which I don't recommend for any purposes at all, I don't think that's a great way to go about feeding cattle. but they sort of like stay buffered in that range because they break down all of the food, ferment it, turn it into what they need, and then they absorb it. It's a little bit different of a conversation when it comes to, phytonutrients, micronutrients. They can't make those, but they can sort of rearrange proteins, carbohydrates, and fats to the macronutrients that they want. And so they break down in their gut, and then they, get to that point of 2 to 3% linoleic acid, polyunsaturated fatty acid, and we can't do that as monogastrics. So there's a lot of research that shows in humans even that our percentage of omega-6 fatty acids, these polyunsaturated fatty acids such as linoleic acid, are increasing dramatically over time. We accumulate these as we eat them because we can't break them down and turn them into other things, say for a couple other, fancy little biochemistry pathways that no need to get into that, but they mostly, as you eat them, the ratio you eat them, get incorporated into your fat tissues. And so the more you eat them, the more your ratios get out of whack. Our body doesn't have a central governor feature that says, hey, we should probably be at 2 to 3% of this, so let's modulate some things. It goes, oh, this is what you gave me for building blocks. This is what we're going to make out of our tissues.
Right.
And so that 2 to 3%, which is species appropriate, and we get higher levels because of the foods we're eating, higher amounts of nuts and seeds, mostly seed oils, because they're very high as far as a percentage of this linoleic acid, fatty acid. We're talking like anywhere from 20% upwards at 80+%, which is insane to have a fat that much when we should be getting that in about 2 to 3% maximum. And with chickens and pigs, what happens, again, being monogastric, they accumulate what they eat. And we've effectively taken all the feed away from these animals and feed them a massive amount. And we'll talk about why this is the case, both for confined animals as well as pastured animals. And these numbers, instead of 2 to 3%, can hover even for regenerative, quote unquote, regenerative, pasture-raised pigs can be between 20 and 30%, which is about like canola oil levels. And then for chickens, we're looking at 40, 50, sometimes up to 60% of their fat can be linoleic acid and omega-6 fatty acids. And I've done actually third-party tests, getting samples across the board from the biggest commodity farms and pasture-raised and, again, quote-unquote regenerative. And there's in some cases where the regenerative / pasture-raised are actually worse from a fatty acid perspective. And we can get into why I think that is, but the big takeaway here is monogastric animals are effectively what they eat, whereas ruminant animals can change around at least the macronutrient composition to form it to what their bodies actually need.
And okay, so if you had an animal, a chicken or a pig that does or never had any supplemental feed, those ratios would look differently, I assume. So if they would
and there's some studies out of like Tokelo tribe and the islanders sort of by Papua New Guinea show tree-dwelling birds, jungle fowl, like what chickens should be, and hogs wild there, their ratios of linoleic acid and polyunsaturated fatty acids are about 2 to 4%. So if they're just eating what they eat in their natural environment, that's what it looks like.
Right.
The issue with that is that those animals take years to grow out. Whereas what we've done in the industry of both pigs and chickens now, this is just an absolute factory machine. Even when you're looking at pasture-raised birds, the farmers need to make their money. And instead of years and years raising these animals out in a natural diet, we're talking 45 days.
Maybe let's talk about, real quick how, popular chicken breeds or one particular one has changed, meaning the one that we eat when we go out and buy chicken in the grocery store or in a restaurant, the Cornish cross, right? If you look at how, and I'm going to try to include some picture for those who are watching the episode, but how the chickens we consume have changed in size and shape over the last few decades by crossbreeding and selection. To make the chest big and fleshy and everything is just unbelievable. And then, it takes a Cornish cross, 8 weeks to slaughter?
Less than that.
Less than that?
Yeah.
45 days, you said, right?
Yeah. Typically 6. Like if it's 8 weeks, you're like that's just dollars of feed, that's dollars of labor. Right. That's other animals that can't be on pasture or in confinement.
Right.
And so, we used to have, we even have this in cattle, for example. People might know of some breeds of cattle. You have Angus you have Highland, you have Aberdeen, Wagyu, like you've heard these terms before. So our cattle breed selection is still like, it's pretty narrow from what exists and what should exist, but there's still a bunch of different breeds for cattle. We don't have just one. Interesting thing with chickens, and to a lesser degree, but still similar, pork and pigs, is we have like 99.9% of the chicken that Americans eat is one breed, Cornish cross.
Yeah.
And that one breed comes effectively from two, maybe like, depending on how you look at it, three hatcheries. So there's basically three companies that control the entirety of chicken genetics, and it's all the same genetics.
Yeah.
To me, that's absurd, but it's also a point of fragility in our food system. That if this species becomes vulnerable to any certain virus, our chicken supply, which is skyrocketing, the demand for it is skyrocketing, could literally vaporize over the course of a couple months. So that to me is not great, but you ask like, why did they do this? So it wasn't some evil plan, but what happened is once we started increasing the production of monocrops like corn and soy and having these leftovers of, we subsidize it, we have a whole ton of this stuff left over. We have farmers, we have industrialized food system. Everyone's trying to make money. We're trying to produce the thing as cheap as possible, as fast as possible. So we effectively selected the breeds that grow the fastest possible in a short amount of time with as fewest inputs as possible. And so what that looks like is over many, many generations, we go from a bird that takes 2 to 3 years to get to a couple pounds, now a bird that takes 45 days to get to 6+ pounds.
Right.
And these birds, essentially, if you stop feeding them corn and soy, they can't go out in the wild and forage and eat regular stuff. They are effectively dependent on these food sources because their genetics are so fragile. They're also a terminal line species, meaning that they cannot reproduce. They have to be created effectively in a lab, and they're not reproducing out. Like if you let a batch of Cornish cross out, they would just all die.
Right.
There's not wild flocks of chickens that would emerge from that.
Right.
Which again, in my mind, you're not even talking about the nutrition, but this fragile of an animal, do I want to eat that? No, not me personally. And there's just so many different ways we can talk about chicken and what you should be eating and how you should be eating. And so we have a production system here where, again, this includes, I'm not saying that this is just the Tyson chicken or the Purdue or these big brands. This is also the vast majority, if not 95% plus of the quote unquote regenerative and pasture-raised birds as well. And I don't fault the farmers for that. We have a system that people are used to paying $5 for a Costco chicken. And so if you actually look at what a chicken should cost, if you were to get a heritage breed chicken and raise it mostly on pasture and rotate it around and all this type of stuff, how a bird should live, you're probably going to be paying upwards of $150 a chicken. Which is insane. And no one would do that. And so you have small farmers who want to do better, but they're sort of fixed to the price system of a massively industrialized food system. So it's a slippery slope. Some of the times with the regenerative, again, in quotations, because I don't think you can have regenerative chickens, you can get a breed called the Red Ranger, which is a little bit more heritage, and that takes 8, 12, sometimes 16 weeks to raise out. And those birds are thinner, more yellow and fat. I think they taste way better. And there's companies like Cook's Venture that are trying to do something where they're making their own breed of chickens. So, I mean, there's not much choice though. You're mostly eating a sick, fragile bird that basically can't walk after 45 days and is so huge from eating corn and soy that literally it can't flap its wings. It can't fly at all. It basically can't walk. You see any of these operations, again, this includes pasture-raised. It's pretty disgusting. Another thing that happens with them is this thing called woody breast syndrome. And so when we were selecting for the Cornish cross to be as big, plump, and have like these enormous breasts, for example, we were just choosing for the animals that had the highest weight. We weren't looking into what the weight was actually comprised of. When you actually look at it, most of the chickens, the Cornish cross, especially the ones that are raised in an industrial setting, have these cross-linkings of proteins in most of their tissues, especially the breast. It's called woody breast And like, if you've chewed on chicken breast before and had like kind of gnarly pieces, this is actually not digestible protein. Because they're cross-linked and your body can't break it down into amino acids. Right. So you might be eating a 10-ounce piece of chicken thinking you're getting X amount of grams of protein, but you're only getting probably 40, 60% of that. Because it's not, their muscles are effectively deformed and your body can't break it down and access it, which is insane.
Right. Yeah. And right now we have 25 leghorns, which I think it's an heritage breed and somewhat close to, whatever the jungle fowl, the wild chicken, is supposed to be. And they are 11 weeks old now. And seriously, I can hold them in one hand. They are so tiny. If you were to butcher them now, there is nothing on that bird.
Yeah, nothing.
And it takes, as you said, 2 years or so. We have some adult leghorns, and at the end of their productive egg laying career, so to say, they have enough meat, but of course by then they are so tough that you can only throw them in a soup or in a stew, but not grill them or whatever. And yeah, that is a big problem. And so would you say then,
which is historically how we've eaten most of these birds, which was in stocks, soups, stews, right, and not these enormous cuts where you're grilling these huge chicken thighs and breasts and things like that. It just wasn't the case. Like our poultry eating history comes down to mostly wild birds, wild turkeys, pheasants, right, things like that, which comprise most of our poultry, not chicken. Chickens on family farms were basically scrap animals that help keep bugs down, right, that we then slaughter, used for eggs. Eggs are phenomenal. And then when we slaughter them, we would just throw them in a stew because there wasn't actually much meat on them.
Right. Yeah.
And then the Cornish cross came along and it changed everything.
Yeah. So now knowing what we've heard, would you say that those omega-6s, the linoleic acid, and some of the other fatty acids that might not be good for optimal health in higher amounts, are the ones found in those animals just as bad as equivalent amounts in, let's say, a seed oil, in a highly processed industrial seed oil? Or is it still better to consume chickens, let's say, than cooking with seed oils? Is there a difference?
Yeah, I think everything like this is always on a spectrum. I don't think there's ever any right or wrong answer, for example. But if you put optimizing fatty acid intake on a line from super ideal to not ideal, I think drinking a glass of soybean oil is probably the worst possible thing you could do on the one end of the spectrum. And then eating probably no fat at all, or a pasture-raised, rotationally grazed piece of a ruminant animal, like a beef or elk or something like that, would be on the other end of the spectrum. And then you ask where does chicken fall in there? And I think for sure it would be better than drinking the soybean oil cup. Right. No doubt. You even there's some research that shows that there's hydrosylates in eggs that help prevent the breakdown and oxidation of linoleic acid and omega-6 fatty acids. So, even when you look at nuts have a very high amount of omega-6 fatty acid, but they also have typically higher amounts of vitamin E. So that vitamin E helps stabilize some of those fats so they're not getting super oxidized quicker. And I have to imagine that there are other things in chicken that would be the same. I don't have any crazy magic compound, but I would imagine that a real food would be better than an ultra processed food. Right. Generally, when you're looking at food on a spectrum, is it good for you versus is it bad for you? And there's this huge gradient in between. What seems to be, and I wish it weren't the case because sometimes it'd be great to just go to the grocery store and eat all this shelf stable food, is that the more processed and shelf stable the food is, right, the worse it is for you. Yeah. And that's for a variety of reasons. There's a ton of great researchers, like Ty Beal's one who does good work on this, but there's a variety of factors that lead to these foods being worse for you than the real food component. I tend to just trust nature and not put too much brain power into thinking what are the exact compounds that are preventing it, and think these are the foods that we've been eating the vast majority of our human history. And to a great degree, you can get that by eating ruminant animals. They're pretty close to wild ruminant animals as far as a nutrient, all this type of stuff. When it comes to raising pigs and chickens, we're actually we're taking the meat as kind of far away from what's been normal throughout human history. as possible in terms of meat go and how that goes. Do I still think that it's probably better than, soybean oil filled dressing? For sure. Do I think that's better than other, plant-based burgers? Yes, for sure. I think that's the case. I don't want to demonize and have people be scared of eating chicken or pork. That's not at all what I'm trying to do. Most people just don't know that. Again, the toughest thing about this is that the marketing is very much like, oh, this is look at this chicken out in pasture. Look at this pig out in pasture. Well, neither of these animals are pasture-raised species to begin with, but that connotation comes with that this is better. And I've worked with a lot of people in the past who had gone keto, gone to a carnivore diet, and ate almost exclusively chicken and pork, and actually got worse than when they were eating diverse amount of food. And so I think that you can overdo it. I don't think it's going to kill you. I think there's things you can do to mitigate it, and there's still choices you can make, and we can talk about that. But it's all, it's all on a spectrum, and it all depends on your goals for sure.
And maybe speaking of, like marketing language, I know there are those omega-3 chickens out there. We talked about it at the in Austin last time when we met, where you can get, chicken that has a very balanced ratio of omega-3 to omega-6, because that's, I think, for the longest, most of my, I guess, when I started paleo, that was one of the key things to watch my ratios, right? To get enough omega-6 to kind of balance out enough omega-3 to kind of balance out the omega-6. And while the balance is certainly a factor, the total amounts are often forgotten, right? If you have ridiculously high amounts of omega-6 and omega-3, it's not necessarily any healthier than having significantly lower amounts and maybe a slightly more unfavorable ratio. Would you agree?
Yeah, this is where I think that we've interpreted data in the wrong way. So the reason why we care about ratio is because we've effectively just compared hunter-gatherer, ancestral man had more of like a 1-to-1, 2-to-1, omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And now that looks closer to 20-to-1, 16-to-1, depending on what data you look at. Is it the ratio that's important here, or is it just the amount of omega-6? And I think the amount of omega-6 is what the troublesome thing is here. Because when you eat these compounds, it's not like they balance each other out, attach to each other, and then you pee or poop them out. Like your body still has to process them and do something with them, no matter the absolute amount. And so what happens is you get a lot of these people saying, oh, our ratio used to be this. People care about omega-3s and omega-6 ratio. So they feed their chickens feed with fish meal and a bunch of other stuff to try to get the omega-3 up. And I've looked at data before and after people have done this. And what happens is people feed their animals way more polyunsaturated fatty acids, which omega-3 is still a PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid, still very unstable. And the ratio gets balanced, but the total amount of omega-6 fatty acids actually goes up significantly.
Right.
And so maybe you have a better ratio, but overall you're getting way more polyunsaturated fatty acid than you would by just consuming the higher ratio. I mean, if you're getting 0.00001 gram of omega-3 and a little bit of omega-6, like I just don't think the ratio, and you get one gram of omega-6, like that ratio is going to look insane, but 1 gram of omega-6 fatty acids is like not going to do anything. And so this is one of those things where I think that we, in the paleo days, the early days, had this conception of ratio. And I think it's just a complete wrong way to look at this topic. And some people are starting to wise up with that, especially like all the research that's being done now in seed oils.
Yeah. All right. So now that we've heard, all of the issues associated with monogastric animals, and that really applies to most, but not necessarily all, right? Because I remember our discussion. You said, well, geese, for example, they can eat only grass and don't need any supplemental feed. And we actually got 2 African geese, and all they do all day is eat grass. Yes, they might sometimes sneak into the chicken feed if it's there, but we could perfectly, if they were not all together, they would only be eating grass. And in such a situation, I would assume the fatty acid profile of a goose would be significantly different than that of a chicken, who gets access to, even if it's soy and corn-free feed, but still, all the grains that are part of the best feed that I could find. is still relatively high in omega-6, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is where it gets kind of complex from the genetics of the animal, what the proper environment the animal actually is. Like geese are meant to be in more plain pasture by ponds, things like kind of like a hybrid between a duck and other poultry. And so they've eaten grass. And then they're also, the way that they grow is very seasonally, unlike a chicken. And so they can put on weight much faster just by eating grass. Chickens also eat grass. They're herbivores. People think that not herbivores, omnivores. And I'm sure your chickens, when they're out, they like kind of peck at everything.
They do.
But chickens are from the jungle. They're jungle fowl. They live in trees. They're prey animals that primarily live in trees in areas like a jungle, which have way more biodiversity and way more bugs and things like that to eat. And the same thing with pigs. They're forest dwellers. So they're supposed to be in the forest, rooting things up, eating literal roots, dead animals, like all these mice, all this type of stuff. And when we take them and put them on grass and in pasture, they just don't have the right food that they should be having. And it takes much longer for them to grow out. And so people, again, just to make the farm economics work, have to bring in typically corn and soy, GMO, non-GMO sometimes, organic sometimes, but nonetheless, even though these, Joel Salatin, people like this are saying, yes, you put them in these houses, rotate them around. That is far better than a conventional setting where they're just on a concrete pad for an enormous amount of reasons. But when you're looking at it from a nutritional reason, like you're still eating an animal, it's not eating its normal diet, not eating what it should be eating. And I think also not living in the environment that it typically should be living in. Geese, good example. Rabbits, another one. Ducks, to some degree, harder to get ducks on like a small acreage. Like if you have hundreds of thousands of acres and you're raising ducks and they can fly around and migrate, it's a different story. But if you're raising ducks, kind of hard to not feed them some sort of supplemental feed. That's part of why we did our farm project, which is to see what animals can you raise in a more species appropriate way and what are the outcomes. Right.
Yeah, makes sense. So what would you tell listeners now? That maybe, families with children love chickens, our kids love chicken, what are practical tips that you can kind of, implement to mitigate maybe some of those issues? You mentioned already a few things that, how you can maybe mitigate the downsides of certain PUFAs. But what would you tell your family if they ask you, hey, should I stop eating chickens and pork, or what do you recommend?
Always depends for the individual and the goal. And so the question is like, are you overweight? Do you have diabetes? Do you have any sort of chronic health condition? Then I would eliminate it. I just don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. The question is also, what are you replacing it with? Are you going to replace it with a Beyond Burger? Or are you going to replace it with like elk that you hunted for your family a month ago? It's very different, like, to have the conversation of what are you replacing it with and what is the goal of the outcome. But just for like a general answer, the one that matters the most always is get as close as possible to your food production and know where it comes from. So if you can go to the farm, meet the farmer, and make an intentional choice about being a participant in your food system, and maybe ask them, hey, can you do corn-free, soy-free? And the animals are still going to be eating grains, and they're still going to be eating supplemental feed that's not appropriate for them from evolutionary history, but it's going to be far better than these massive monocrop corn and soy outcomes. And so this is just the thing of like, I'm not aware of any commercially available pork and chicken that I would want to eat personally. I eat pork and chicken when I know who grows it and what they're feeding the animals and how they're raised. There's an amazing ranch here in Central Oregon called Cascade, and they do a closed loop pig system where they grow all of the grain and all of the feed for the pigs on their own farm. And then they root up all the old vegetables and they feed them like spent orchards. It's a phenomenal operation. Like I eat that pork. I don't eat a ton of it just because I prefer to eat more ruminant meat, but is as involved with your food system as you can get is always the answer. I think no matter if it's pork, chicken, produce, honey, milk, whatever it is, if you can go and see where your food's being produced, have a conversation with the farmer and get your food from there, as close as you can get to the ideal, or producing it yourself in your backyard or whatever, that's always the best option.
All right. Makes sense. Yeah, and actually yesterday my wife told me, hey, we need to be raising meat birds because the kids really like it, and we don't want to buy, them from places where and the other thing, unrelated to the fatty acid profile, but all the chickens or the chicken meat you can buy, it was all like submerged in chlorine, right? If it was, the bird was slaughtered in a USDA inspected facility, it's not, there is some processing being done to make it compatible with federal laws before it can be sold, and that by itself, would be reason enough for me to say, okay, even if it's, if we have to, raise red rangers, and feed them, corn and soy-free, organic feed, even if it's grains and still higher in omega-6 than I would like, but that's probably the best we can do. To be able to eat,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's totally fine. I mean, you guys are also, you have to take it in context of your normal diet. Like if you're eating Chick-fil-A every day and then you eat more omega-6 chicken, like that's probably not an ideal thing, right. But like someone like you who is exceedingly healthy, I don't think it matters. I don't think people should even worry about it. And also to the other end of the spectrum, and we talked about the ideal thing. That's assuming you have excess time and money to go to the farm and find the things or grow the animals yourself or whatever. There's also a reality where it's hard for people to acquire food for either financial means or convenience. And right. I think if that's the boat you're in and you're looking to get pork or chicken at Costco even or Walmart or whatever, I still think that's a much better choice than most stuff that people get in packages. Yeah. And one thing you could do then, if you are going to eat lower quality, just get the leaner parts, because that way you're avoiding some of the fat, and you're still getting plenty of the nutrition that's in the animal. So yeah, I mean, there's so much nuance to this, and as far as there's always a spectrum of making a better choice, and that better choice comes to availability, accessibility, cost, tolerance, time and effort. And so, I think that the number one thing is are you being intentional with what you're putting in your mouth? I think if we just got Americans being intentional about what they're doing and making a choice for a specific reason, we'd have a dramatic shift in our food system. And so that's what I asked for people. Just try to be intentional as much as you can and make the best decision that you can for your family. And that's going to change for people seasonally, yearly, whatever. And it's the best you can do always. All
right. Sounds good. Well, I very much appreciate your time. I know you're very, very busy with all the projects you have going on. I'm going to link everything where people can find you in the show notes. So your Instagram, your brands, your newsletter. I think that's one thing I really want to point out. There's only one newsletter that I read regularly, and that's yours. It's always good.
I should probably send more of them in, huh?
That's right. Well, actually, I think the cadence is okay because, by the time I read it, I'm like, I really need to research that stuff. And then, it takes me a while, and then your next newsletter comes out. And by that time, hopefully I've done my research and I've implemented whatever you recommended. So I think the cadence is not bad, but it's always good. There's always something in there that I didn't know. And I wish I should have, I would have known before. So I really liked it. And obviously, your podcast as well, one of my favorites. So thanks again for making the time. And yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.